now available in paperback and e-readers. Isis, Revenge of the Cyber Goddess. The goddess next door takes on the threat of a deadly digital diva driven to destroy the world in this action-packed, all-new Isis series adventure. Get Isis, Revenge of the Cyber Goddess featuring a bonus pin-up and the other 2 books in the Cyber Goddess saga at online bookstores everywhere today. America could be facing a homeless crisis worse than the Hoovervilles of the 1930s if the federal government does not step in and do something to extend the eviction moratoriums that have been going on all across the country. Now, back in 2020, during the darkest days of the COVID-19 pandemic, your President Trump at the time, with the help of the Congress and the Senate, went out here and established eviction moratoriums, which put a freeze on rent and put a freeze on mortgages all across the country. And with that freeze on rent and freeze on evictions, many families which had recently lost their jobs due to the COVID-19 pandemic lockdowns, which were meant to flatten the curve on COVID-19, were allowed a place to shelter in place to avoid getting COVID-19. And now that the worst of the pandemic is practically nearly over, you now have a big problem because recently a federal judge struck down the CDC's ability to establish eviction moratoriums, and the states out here are starting to ramp up their court processes as related to evicting Americans all across the country. And with over 7 to 20 million Americans on the brink of losing their homes, we are on the brink of a possible economic collapse worse than the stock market crash of 1929. And that all could be done if the current policies remain in place and the federal government does not take an effort to step in and curb the greed of many of these landlords and many of these short-sighted banks who don't really see the big picture as related to the damage they could possibly do to America's economy as it tries to rebuild. Now, when I take a critical examination of many of these individuals who want to go out here and try to evict all these millions of Americans all across the country, I believe many of these people are just letting their greed make them not see the big picture. Now, many of these landlords, as I see it, are not really critically thinking about the big picture, and some are caught up in their emotions about the letters that they're getting as related to their property and being overdue in mortgage payments. And others are just being greedy, not really thinking about the big picture because they're not really understanding the whole overall economic impact on the country. Now, the critical question that I would have to ask many of these landlords is, who are you going to rent to? Because half the country is still unemployed, and with half the country still unemployed, that means there aren't going to be a lot of people out here to be able to get enough money to pay the first and last month's rent and a security deposit to you. So many of these landlords are not really thinking critically about the whole economic situation. They're thinking, oh, I'll kick this person out and I'll be able to find someone else. Well, there is no one else when half the country is unemployed and there is nobody out here who actually has enough money to pay a first and last month's rent, and there's nobody there to pay a security deposit. And the same thing goes on for many of your banks out here who are short-sighted and thinking, oh, because there's a housing boom, because people are buying homes, they can go out here and foreclose on the other half of the homes across the country which have missed a payment. Now, what they don't really see about the big picture is that if those homes start to default and those mortgage owners start to default, what happens is this causes a domino effect on the economy. And what happens is that you're starting to have more of this property where people are being kicked out of their property, and that's going to lower the value of the real estate across the country. And when you lower the value of the real estate, that lowers property taxes. And when you lower property taxes, that winds up having a ripple effect on the overall economy. And because many of these banks are not really thinking critically about these foreclosures, this is going to lead to a devastating impact, because instead of there being a big demand for homes, what you're going to do is create a large supply. And even worse, you're not going to have any customers to buy any of this property, because when you have half the people in the country unemployed, what happens is you're going to have nobody with a job or the money to go out here and have the money to be able to pay a down payment. So when I look at many of these landlords and many of these banks which run these mortgages, many of these people are getting ahead of themselves, because the country just hasn't even started to recover from the economic damage of the COVID-19 pandemic. Yes, many businesses are starting to open back up that were said to be non-essential, and many businesses are starting to try to have these employee shortages, but the whole thing is America is not back yet up on its feet. And because America is not yet back up on its feet, you have many of these guys trying to run before they can walk. And if they start running, they're going to wind up tripping up millions of Americans and knocking them down before they can get back up on their feet. And this type of economic damage can have lasting impact on a fragile economy that has already been battered to the point where most Americans have become frustrated, most Americans have become angry, and most Americans are headed towards that point of nothing to lose. And that's something that many of these businesses aren't really thinking about. They're not understanding that sometimes it pays to be patient, because you can get a bigger profit in the long term. Yes, there are people in many of these apartments who haven't been able to pay their rent over the last year, but you have to give those people time to get back up on their feet. Because if you don't give those people time to get back up on their feet, then there's nobody you're going to have that's going to be able to rent your property, and your property's value is going to drop. Because when you create large homeless populations like we had during the Hooverville era of the 1930s, then there is nobody that you can go out here and rent to, and your property is going to have no value because all of the homeless people being around that property. And many of those people are going to be angry and resentful because they were kicked out of their homes through no fault of their own. And those type of people, they become the type of people who become so angry, they practically would become like those mobs, that mob that stormed the Capitol on January 6th. So it's not really smart to go out here and push people out of their homes, because when you push people out of their homes, what you're going to do, again, is create this large homeless population, and you're going to create a population of people who have nothing to lose. And you really don't want to create a population of people with nothing to lose, because people with nothing to lose, instead of them wanting to try to build a life in a home or a piece of property, they want to destroy the world around them. So many of these landlords and many of these banks, as I see it, mortgage companies, they need to just put the brakes on things and take a chill pill, because you're trying to run ahead of everyone. And when you run ahead of everyone, you wind up undermining all of the progress we have made over the last year. Because when you go out here and evict people, all you're going to do is lead to more people on the streets. And if more people are on the streets, we could have a resurgence of COVID-19, because we don't even have half the country out here that has taken the vaccine. So people are not really connecting dots to see the big picture as related to this pandemic, and they can't really see how they need to play their role until the end of the pandemic is announced by the Biden administration. Because if you go out here and jump the gun, you could wind up undermining all of the progress everyone has made in the last year. And if you go out here and undermine all of that progress, what you're going to do is wind up taking the country back instead of moving it forward. And this is something many landlords aren't really thinking about, because they're getting emotional about debt, they're getting emotional about bills, and nobody is really sitting there thinking critically, yes, we have a pandemic going on, but we need to get half the country back to a position where they're on their feet economically, and we need to get the American people back working and get them stable, because working, stable people are core to keeping our economy strong. And if we don't work to get American people and invest in the American people, then there's nobody going to be there to have enough money to pay for an apartment's first and last month's rent and security, and there won't be anybody out here to have enough money for a down payment on a mortgage in the long term. Because yes, we've had a surge of people go out here and buy all of these homes, but they won't be able to maintain those homes if we have a homeless explosion. Because where you have all of these people with homes, you're going to have lots of homeless people, because homeless people go where the resources are. And then you're going to have a whole lot of abandoned property all across the country, because if there's nobody there to rent the property, nobody's going to be able to pay the property tax, the maintenance, or the insurance on much of the vacant property, because there's not going to be anybody there to rent the property. Now, there's some people who will think, oh, they'll bring some foreigners in, or they'll bring some Section 8 in, but that's not going to be enough money from the government, because the government will be overwhelmed, because you're going to have more of this type of person in the neighborhood, and the government's going to have to pay all of that property. And that's not going to be good for the government long term if you have 7 to 8 million or 20 million people who are out here and they're on Section 8, because what's going to happen is that's going to wind up with the government taking a huge burden, and the government having all these people dependent on it. And you don't want to have all these people dependent on the system. What you want to have in a capitalist, consumer-based economy is folks working. And in order to get this country working again, everybody just needs to be patient. Everybody needs to just really start to, again, take a chill pill, and everybody needs to slow down, because it takes time to get an economy back rolling, and it's not going to happen overnight. And while you have people, again, reacting to things like, oh, there's a worker shortage, it takes at least a month for somebody to make enough money to get a paycheck. So a lot of people are not really thinking critically about everything as related to economics. They're just thinking, where's my money? But you're not going to get your money unless you take the time to go out here and help those who have been taken off their feet due to a whole flatten the curve theory that is flatlined our economy. In order to get this economy jump started, you have to give people patience, you have to give people time, and you have to go out here and really understand how the mechanics of economics works. And sadly, you have too many people out here, especially those who have college degrees these days, who really do not understand the mechanics of economics. And because they don't understand the mechanics of economics, they're looking to try to get a fast dollar, not understanding a fast dollar could slow the economy's rising momentum and take us further into a deeper recession that could turn basically into a darker depression than the Great Recession of 2008 and the Great Depression of the 1930s. And that's all could be done because we have people out here who really are thinking of self, like a lot of baby boomers, and a lot of these people are not really thinking about the big picture. And because they're not thinking about the big picture, they're not understanding the guy you evict right now could be the next homeless person. And again, when you have large populations of homeless people, like we had in the Hooverville days of the 1930s, this depresses wages, this depresses property values, because when you have lots of homeless people in a neighborhood, nobody wants to rent there, and that's going to make it harder for you to rent that property again, and it's going to make it even harder for you to pay your property taxes, maintenance, and insurance at that point, and your property values are going to drop down to zero because you're not thinking about the long term, you're thinking about the short term. And we need more people to think about the long term, because when you think about the long term, then you can really profit overall, because the more Americans you can get back on your feet, the higher a price you can charge for rent, or the higher price you can charge for a home. But the more homeless people that you have on the street, there's no way you're going to be able to charge any rent, or be able to even get any sort of economic return as related to selling a home. So a lot of these people don't really understand the concepts of economics as related to supply and demand, but I'll try to break it down for you so you can understand economics as related to supply and demand. If there's a large supply of homeless people on the streets, there is going to be no demand for homes. And if there's a large supply of working people, there's going to be a higher demand for homes. So it's basic economics, but many people, they're only thinking short term about what they can get right now. But if you thought critically, you would be able to make more money in the long term, and you'd be able to benefit in the long term, because the more Americans we help out during this dark period get back on their feet, the more money we will be able to make in the long term. I mean, many employers out here and many landlords really need to start thinking critically, because it's their greed that is going to undermine this recovery and wind up with many innocent Americans winding up losing everything that they have, all because they're looking to make a few cents in the short term and not thinking about all of the dollars they could make in the long term. Because if you destroy somebody's life, it takes them decades to rebuild things, and it takes them even longer to get back to a place where they can afford to either rent a property or buy a home. And I know this because as somebody who lost a job in the Great Recession, I'm still trying to get back on my feet. And the whole thing was, unemployment was cut off for me in 2011. I still wasn't able to find a job due to HR brick walls and people not really being understanding. I mean, I even had interviews where people were asking me, what was I doing during the Great Recession when there were next to no jobs in a job interview? I mean, if you're looking for work, that's what you're doing. I mean, this is the type of ignorance that people run into. And sadly, we have a lot of selfish, greedy people out here. And because they're not really having any sort of compassion on their fellow Americans, they are going to wind up hurting the entire country, because they're caught up on their feelings about short-term money that they think that they're not going to be able to make, and bills are not going to be able to pay in the short term, not understanding that if we don't help people in the long term, there's not going to be any money for anybody to make at all. And homeless people on the streets, it's a lot harder for them to get back up on their feet, because when you're filled with anxiety and stress about how you're going to get through a day, then that leads to a further escalation of all the mental health problems we saw during the pandemic from all of these people being isolated. And if we were to evict these people, we would wind up having a mental health crisis all across this country. So people are not really thinking critically out here, and this is the big problem, because a critical thinker would let people know, look, even though people are getting better and the country is getting a little bit better, we need to take our time and understand that, okay, yes, the people are opening back up, but we can't rush and evict people out of their homes. We have to give people time, and it may be 2023, 2024 before we really start to get out of this mess, because it's going to take years to get this economy back to a point where it can start to recover. And this is something that, again, many people aren't thinking about, because they just want to rush back to making fast dollars, but it doesn't make sense to rush to fast dollars when you can go out here and really help keep a lot of these people off the streets, because each person you keep off the streets and keep out of the homeless system is a person who can go out here and become a future renter or a future home buyer. But that flies over the heads of many of your landlords and your banks, because they're feeling and not thinking. And what we need are more critical thinkers who can think about a big picture. And we need less people getting in their emotions, thinking about putting people out instead of helping to help move and put them in a place where they can get ahead. Now, a viewer requested this video, and if you want to request a video and I know something about the subject, you can donate to the Cash App by clicking the links in the description box. And if you want to try some of my SJS Direct publications that present positive images of black people, like the ISIS series, the E-Steam series, the John Haynes series, the Recipe for Success, the Thetas, and the books of the Spinsterella trilogy, or my men's issues books, you can find all of those books in paperback and Kindle format on Amazon.com. And if you can also find those books on Smashwords, the iBookstore, and Google Play. And if you want to see me be able to make more videos like this, you can donate to my Patreon, my PayPal, or my Cash App by clicking the links in the description box. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe. Now available in paperback and e-readers, John Haynes, Taking Care of Business. The man who rules the world breaks in a brand new partner to help him take care of business in this action-packed, all-new John Haynes series adventure. Get John Haynes, Taking Care of Business at paperback and e-readers at online booksellers everywhere.